GABA is a nonprofit organization promoting business between California and Germany, and is only funded by membership and event fees. We used to offer in-person panel discussions and networking events several times a month. Now we switch to online events because we want to stay in touch with our community and give our GABA members and followers the opportunity to stay connected with each other by events like this and exchange your ideas. About half of today's attendees, as far as I can tell, are actually GABA members, and I want to really thank you and appreciate your support. I want to say that I appreciate your support during this remarkable and for many difficult times. We are actually currently organizing these events for free because we want to keep supporting the German American community. And we know that some people have been impacted more than others. Nevertheless, we would like you to consider a small donation, if you can, of $10, $20, or $5 for the events you're attending, so we can keep offering these valuable events to you. Now I would like to quickly introduce the speakers we have today. And that is Chris Booth, who is actually sometimes called the father of the Corona app in Germany. He's an expert in everything security and artificial intelligence, and founder of Arago. Then I'd like to introduce you to Jay Heglar. He's the Chief Business Officer at Domo, and they make contact tracing apps for businesses. Then I'd like to introduce quickly Eddie Holman. He is of counsel at Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati, and in the privacy and cybersecurity space. The last speaker is Thomas Kahl, a partner at Taylor Wessing, and his specialty is tech and privacy. And furthermore, I'd like to introduce you to Sandro Geiken, our moderator of today. Dr. Sandro Geiken is the founder and director of the Digital Society Institute at the European School of Management and Technology in Berlin, one of the top 10 business schools in Europe. His institute does research on strategic and responsible digitalization. For some Germans, it might be noteworthy that Sandro was a member of the Chaos Computer Club, an hacktivist, but that was long ago. And more recently, he advised the German government, where he developed the German foreign cyber policy strategy. He also supported the NATO as an expert in cyber defense. On the corporate side, Sandro advises companies on secure cyber business models, and he founded his own cybersecurity companies, including Secure Elements Limited, which is now a JV between Airbus Defence and Space and KKR Holdings. You will also find his learnings and advice in print and online, in scientific monographs, op-eds, or comments in major newspapers and online outlets. Sandro, please take it from here.
Yes, thank you, Michaela, and welcome everybody. Good morning to California, good evening to Germany, good night to the Chinese spies listening in. Yeah, I was very excited when Uwe from GABA contacted me on the tracing apps, because if you live in Germany and you read German newspapers online these days, you get the impression that the tracing app is the worst part of the entire pandemic, because everybody's so excited about what it is, what it does, what it doesn't do. And surprisingly, when you're looking into US media, there seems to be the same sentiment. There's a lot of discussion going on about the tracing app, who should do it, how it should be done, if it's effective at all. So I think this is a very hot topic, a very interesting topic, and I'm very much looking forward to discuss this today with the panel and of course with the group that you have gathered here. I think before we jump into the discussion, I just wanted to give the panelists a very quick 2 lines each to introduce themselves on why they are here and what they think they particularly have in mind for tracing apps for the discussion. So if we could quickly just start with Jay.
Yep. Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Jay Heglar. I work for an American software company called Domo. We deliver SaaS applications and data platform. And where we contribute to this entire discussion is we've put in market for private sector a group of applications that we call the Get Back to Work solution. And one element of that is contact tracing. And so our contribution to that will be how we're starting to enable privately held organizations around the world to deliver contact tracing as a means of employee safety.
Thanks, great. Eddie.
Hi there, this is Eddie Holman. I'm of counsel Wilson Sonsini. Represent a lot of companies on privacy, cybersecurity issues. I seem to get new clients every day right now in this get back to work space from more established clients like Domo to there seem to be startups popping up every day wanting to get a piece of this return to work gold rush. So it's a hot area, and we're been advising on various solutions that everybody's coming up with. So excited to have a discussion here today with everyone.
Thanks, Chris.
My name is Chris Boos. I run an AI company, and we're focused on business process automation, basically simulating human experts to find solutions for all types of tasks. I am a member of the Digital Council of the German government. And in that capacity, really early on, when there were very few cases in Germany, we had a discussion on how we can do tracing apps or how we can trace infection chains in Germany effectively, because we saw the Chinese and the South Korean examples, and they were really very infringing on privacy and basically would destroy the fundamentals of a liberal democracy. So our question was, how can we prevent that? Created an initiative of a lot of scientists and other crazy people and try to set a standard for, at the time, pan-European or global interoperability between those various approaches of tracing that would all be privacy preserving. And from there, we got roped in a bit into the German app implementation, which was initially supposed to run on a centralized data model. Then the German government switched this to a decentralized model, which has just been launched 2 days ago. Actually, quite a lot of downloads, which is great. The standard discussion that we had in this initiative went to the European Standards Institution for Telecommunication and is now an industry standards group, so that we can find over time, where every country has their own tracing solution right now that is working for public, that over time we can find a way for all of those to interoperate. And at the back of that, of course, like a lot of other people, we have started to make part of the solutions that were built available commercially in a more end-to-end way, not just in a tracing way, but also including medical testing and medical services, because tracing is only, especially in countries where you have not a good test regime, tracing by itself simply doesn't help.
Thank you. And Thomas.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thomas Karl, my name, from Germany. I'm an IT partner with Taylor Wessing from the Frankfurt office. So I would primarily advise on IT and data protection. And I'd say for the last couple of weeks, a lot of questions popping up here when it comes to back to work, back to the workplace solutions, including tracing apps. So that's certainly something that we have been dealing with for a couple of weeks now. And I also had the chance to let's say, take a deep dive into data protection privacy issues when it specifically comes to tracing apps. We as Taylor Wessing supported the first stage of the Corona tracing app project in Germany. And so happy to be here today and hopefully bring in some perspective from a German angle.
Okay, thank you. So excellent panel. And now before we start the discussion, we have a little poll prepared. Which I would now like to ask Yvonne and Michaela to start, where you decide if you want to actually partake in tracing. So this will be something that will be interesting to look at, especially before and after the discussion, that we can see if we sway some of those opinions. Okay, so jumping into the discussion, I think one first element that must be in the back of our minds when we're talking about these things is the effectiveness of tracing apps for the control of the pandemic. So this is the first question. I mean, it doesn't make sense to introduce something and hotly debate something that isn't even effective. And there has actually been some research. Of course, we know some countries with a good track record in pandemic control, like Korea, who managed, in particular, also because they used tracing apps, also because they used a bunch of other mechanisms, managed quite well to sail through the pandemic and get their economies back up and get their public life back up. But of course, it's sort of an open question in this mix of measures. How important is a tracing app in the middle of all this? And some recent research, for example, which has been published from China, suggested that contract tracing results in a proportional reduction in reproduction number, flattening the epidemic curve, but only having sizable impact on final size when a large proportion of contacts are perfectly traced. So in other words, some of this research suggests that contract tracing could be a good measure, but it has to be perfect, and it has to cover a rather large proportion of the population. So this is something in the West, if we're not making this mandatory but voluntary, and I think the downloads so far in Germany have been something like 6 million, which is 8% of the German population. Is that really enough? So the first question I would like to ask my panel, and I'm curious about the answer because I would like one myself, is what can we say about the effectiveness of such an app?
No one's answer, and then I go first. I mean, obviously, the more people participate in this, the better it is. And the Chinese study you're mentioning just verifies the results that the Oxford Institute for Big Data already published in way before the pandemic on tracing, where you said that if tracing was the only thing that that was the measure, you'd need about 60% of the population covered. And of course, if you only have like 10% covered, then you need a lot of other measures. And if you follow those curves, depending on if you can do risk scoring or no, you'll have to see that at least you will have to find about 70% of infected people or potentially infected people actually, or you'll have to be able to trace back 70% of the contacts an infected person has. And the point is with a virus of that incubation time, you can only do that electronically, like no one else can manage, but it means a lot of people will have to download it. I would say anything over 20% gets you a very good effectiveness. Before 20%, you'll see that you'll need a lot of other measures like distancing, masks, danger in public transport, lots of disinfectants, which have their own problems, right? Because we're breeding resistant bacteria and things like this. So there should be a high motivation of downloading it, but you don't need the 100% coverage.
Okay, anybody else wants to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll chime in. So I agree with Chris. I mean, the thing I think to look at through these apps is that they're really an augmentation of traditional contact tracing solutions. You know, the state of California is hiring thousands of people to engage in manual contact tracing, at least from the publications from a day or two ago. They don't seem to be contemplating cell phone location tracking or anything like that. So, but the downside, of course, of those manual processes is that, I mean, some people might think them very invasive. They might not answer the call from a contact tracer, and they're slow. You know, that as Chris said, you really need to be able to identify contacts very quickly. But it's not. I don't think we should be looking at this through, oh well, you know, if nobody's going, if we're not, there isn't a. Oh, Zoom is giving me a bunch of warnings here. Can you all still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Short story, yes. I basically we shouldn't be putting the perfect should not be the enemy of the good here. I think there's opportunity to explore this, maybe in the public space, even more so in the private space. And I think we'll talk about this from the context of employers for certain.
Yeah, and then on the private sector side, by the way, I agree with everything that Eddie and Chris said. On the private sector side, we think that the app is actually a part of the solution and not the only solution. So we in the conversations we had with market in terms of testing and acceptance, we found that people didn't really want to associate their employer and their ability to be traced with their own mobile device. So they wanted to really have that separation of their personal computing device, which has all their contacts and everything, and what the employer could do. So we found that the acceptable solution was really one that augmented multiple types of capability. One would be a tracing element that Eddie just talked about in terms of the traditional mechanisms, but then tying into things that people are already doing today so that it's less invasive. An example of that would be a badge access system, using that as a point of data, or any time that you use some sort of a device that registers a digital log, incorporating that into your trace as well. So then you're not having one point of failure, but you're introducing multiple points of redundancy that you can actually perform a better trace. And so we chose to go the route with our customers of app-based in terms of data collection and augmenting the actual tracing, rather than it being a peer-to-peer system that relies solely on a phone-based app.
Sorry, one question though. If it's not, I think we're going to measure and track the effectiveness of the solution. If it's not going to be as effective as we hope, will we shut it down, or is this something that will just stay with us and we hope that eventually it will be more efficient? Or should we shut it down, especially because of the controversy and privacy?
So
no, we shouldn't shut it down. Because every little helps, and as Eddie said, the perfect is the enemy of the good here, and it's kind of in Germany, right? We have so many discussions about privacy, and at the same time, while we're having these discussions, the #1 downloaded apps in a week or in a month is WhatsApp and TikTok. I'm sorry, this does not go together. Neither WhatsApp nor TikTok's parents companies are going to give you any medical treatment. The public healthcare system will, which is totally privacy invasive because you're registering with your name and so on and so forth. I mean, we've got to leave. Honestly, if it helps a little, we should have it in place. So much effort has been made to make this privacy protecting. And I think now with a decentralized solution in Germany and maybe a more centralized solution in France, we'll see the different impacts of these things. And we also see the adoption where they're higher, and that will give us a lot of mention. But I don't think with even the download rates, at least in Germany, we see for the first couple of days, I think that already says that this is something that will contribute.
So I see some questions in the chat about demographics that maybe don't have smartphones that are capable of running these apps. I think that's definitely a valid concern. But I think, as Chris and I have been saying, we don't need to get to 100% adoption for it to be good for everyone. I don't think just the people who are running these apps are the ones who benefit from it. I think it's important to look at all of this through the lens of, as we try to contain the pandemic, there is a trade-off of how we are limiting individuals' rights, and not just privacy, but absent a contact tracing solution, we're left with restrictions on freedom of movement, where we can open everything up, but then we risk people's right to live, right to work. And so, it's right now the discussion seems to be a very privacy maximizing one, and that's fine. But I think it's important to look at these through the lens of like, what are all of the controls that we can put in place to control the pandemic, and how can we balance these various rights against one another? One interesting solution that I've heard on the communities that don't necessarily have smartphones, and is also an interesting one for making sure that this technology does not spread farther than it needs to is, well, why doesn't we should have the government buy them all smartphones and pay for their data plans and then make it very expensive so that it gets shut down very quickly when it's not necessary anymore. I think it's an interesting idea for sure. But you know, we should be trying to service those communities, absolutely. But I think those communities can benefit from, you know, the rest of the population who can run these apps, running the apps.
Okay, thank you. I think one topic though, if we're looking at the effectiveness, is the hierarchy of values. And Thomas, I know that in preparation of the call, you wrote a bunch of points on that, on how to balance different kinds of rights. And sitting in Germany and looking at the discussion, I think personally, I used to be a big fan of data protection, I have to say, but I have to say that the impression right now in this particular context, Germans being super crazy and sensitive about data protection in light of a declining economy, of an economic crisis, of a pandemic going on, costing lives, and also in light of much larger things like China becoming a new major global power with very severe implications for human and civil rights. I'm sometimes uncertain if we have the right balance of values. I think before the balance of legal rights, the balance of values is maybe something. So my personal impression was that in this case, if you're looking at the big picture, probably data protection shouldn't be all that important. And actually one question that I asked myself in light of this effectiveness, if we shouldn't probably make it less voluntary and force people actually to download the app and to use it somehow for the greater good. And the greater good really is the economy. The greater good is the global democracy fighting against states like China in this global war for power that's going on. So the question, I think, is what is the right big picture to apply, and how do we rank values? Is this search for data protection not just still the spoiled kid from yesterday who wants civil rights but doesn't really understand what's going on globally and what the costs are and everything? Yeah, just want to ask the panel what their opinion is. Should we enforce the tracing app? Is this the right balance of power? How important is privacy in tracing apps, really?
Maybe I can start from a German perspective, because luckily today the German data protection authorities have issued a very short but very precise statement covering exactly that. So we had huge discussions in the last couple of weeks, even though the German app was not even available, whether like an employee would be entitled to take the app and tell employees install it on your phones and use it. There were different approaches. As you just mentioned, voluntariness is now the approach that the German app takes, and well, most of the data protection community focuses on that voluntariness. And the German data protection authorities have made very clear today that they would be totally against any sort of use of the German app that has been published this week in another context. So for example, like a restaurant owner asking people to show the app before they can enter the store, or an employee telling employees to use the app. So that's indeed feels, it does feel a bit odd, because obviously a lot of companies are asking exactly that question. Can I protect myself? Can I protect my employees? Can I protect my business? What I believe personally is that under that discussion, we'll see more private sector driven solutions, and certainly not, or rather not, a use of, for example, the German app now by business in order, for example, to protect their employees. So this will certainly be one effect.
And one of the things that we consider also is just the duty of care of the safety of employees. So, you know, at some point in time, there is going to be a balance. So Sandra, to your point, there needs to be a balance of what kind of data you're willing to give, but then also what kind of data you're expecting your employer to provide from others around you. And so that's one of the considerations that we've made with our customers, is to really figure out what is that balance. And if there is some application that's managing some data or gathering data about you, when is that data used, and who has access to it? So it really comes down to just the privacy element there is just access to data and what aspects that data is being used from. And so in our case, our customers ask us not to be a data gatherer, but to provide ephemeral solutions that have an answer. So if we ask an employee to input your data or your temperature, we're not actually storing data. We're presenting a digital badge that they could present upon entry to their physical location. And so what that does is, from a privacy perspective, that hasn't done anything to make the employee uncomfortable. But what it does is it recognizes, or it allows that employee to recognize that everybody that works with them and alongside them in that facility has gone through the same exercise. So they feel like that duty of care provided by their employer is very, very high.
Yeah, so just on the U.S. legal side, it's certainly different than the European approach. It's almost completely weighted the other way, because as Jay mentioned, there is an obligation on employers to provide a safe workplace for employees. And as states reopen here, they're issuing guidelines that are effectively mandates on what sort of screening do you have to do, how to keep people who are infected out of your workplace, and also that if somebody gets infected in your workplace, that you have an obligation to sort of try to figure out, did they get it at work? So this is, the contact tracing is certainly going to be an important part of figuring that out.
So I think,
yeah, sorry.
I think there's a difference between what governments do and what you do in a company, right? Because we don't, especially with the experience we had in Germany twice, we don't want the government to know where everybody is at all times. So it is clear that we have a focus on privacy protection here. And I would also say that it would be such a great democratic symbol if people had enough responsibility and showed enough solidarity to make this work voluntarily. And I think for public spaces, it just should. Then in Germany, we also have duty of care of the employers towards their employees. Plus, you simply need to know. I mean, it's a risk-based question. Like, do you have to shut down the entire factory, or do you have to, which has a huge economic impact? And there you see the difference between having to take a binary decision in, for example, a solution where you don't have any data, like most of those decentralized solutions are. You simply have to send every contact home, as where you have data, and the research currently shows that you'll be sending 60% fewer people home. And if you do that inside a company and you actually manage this together with which teams work together, how can I prevent spreading? What test regime should I implement in order to make sure that I have, even if there are teams that are at higher risk because they need more people, that there is a low protection? I think that a lot of the things that you can't do simply because of civil rights in the public space, and you don't want to do in the public space, is going to happen in the workplace anyway, because today an employer knows who's on their premises. There's no data protection there because that's what they need to know, and they have to provide a safe workplace. But that's also a filter to filter out infected cases and put more safety back into public. So I think companies are going to play a very vital role in this.
So what would be good solutions in the company space? Are there any good ideas out there in the corporate space regarding tracing of employees, tracking of sick people? How do they differ to the government approaches? And what would you think would be a good model for companies to adopt? Also, first of all, on the legal basis, what is legal? There would probably be a question to Thomas and Eddie. And then also on the technical side, depending on what is legal in the corporate space, how can we implement it and make tracing at large more effective?
So when we look at the app that is available in Germany right now, it's 100% based on consent, right? So you have to click through, you always have to consent. That will certainly not work in the workplace, at least not under GDPR, not under German law, because it will rather be doubted that a consent given by an employee, when the employer tells the employee to use a certain app, will still be voluntary. So in the end, you will have another, we would call it legal basis. So it's another From a data protection perspective, it's another approach. And we certainly do have rules in the law for that. There will be huge discussions around whether this is possible or not, and if so, under what circumstances. But a lot of people are already arguing that it must somehow be possible, maybe other than some of the authorities in Germany. And the approach that most of the people take is that they then focus first on where would such an application be installed. So it would certainly be a problem if an employer would ask the employee to install it on a private device. This will certainly be problematic, but maybe not so much on a business device. First of all, and second of all, that companies will have to sort of look at the actual use scenarios. So if you have high risk scenarios like in a hospital or something like that, then it will certainly, from a legal perspective, be easier to argue pro such an approach than under other scenarios.
Yeah, so it's on the US side, it's a little bit of a complicated question. You know, because we don't have a law like GDPR, we have to look to a lot of different sectoral issues. You know, under the ADA, if you're collecting information that is medical information from employees, you've got to keep that confidential. You got to keep it, you know, separate from the personnel record. But that said, there's a lot of information. I think as Jay, you know, said that employers are already collecting with regard that may reflect, you know, where are employees, what work are they doing, and you know, certainly a lot of employers already have badge readers. They already have security cameras. They already log. You know, for security reasons, employers, you know, logging into the different systems. You also, I think, have to think about, you know, is an app on a smartphone really the best way to trace in the workplace? Because you may have restrictions on employees who aren't allowed to have a phone with them for good reason, or they're working, you know, on a shop floor and it's unsafe. And so we have to think about what are other solutions around that. You know, could you require an employee to install like the public health app on their phone? It depends a little bit, probably, but as Thomas said, it's not great to that you run into more complications when you're forcing people to install, you know, somebody else's app on their personal device to get into a building. There's, you know, wage and hour issues and other complicated things. I think the cleaner solution will be to, you know, do something like provide a hardware device to employees. It doesn't rely on a phone, or as Jay said, rely on bringing in data from other systems to try to build something that's not so, you know, single point of failure.
Yeah, and so
that's exactly what's happening, right? Integration into the systems that are already there, like Jay's describing, or hardware devices that have actually even more accurate measurement.
Yeah. So at risk of sounding like a commercial, if you all go to getbacktowork.com, you'll see a bit of how we're approaching this, which is taking into consideration everything that's going on here, including the chat. So the chat comments are great, so please keep them coming. So abandoning the phone concept because it was just too controversial in the private sector, and we really feared low adoption based upon our customers. What we wanted to do was we wanted to help. The number one thing we were trying to do is just provide employee safety. And when you explain that to your employees, what you're doing, and by frankly, also just be transparent, what's being done to you. So what we did was we decided to have an app be part of the solution, but not the entire solution. So what people wanted to do, as Eddie mentioned, is, you know, they wanted to keep people that were impacted or potentially impacted out of the work environment. And so the first way that they do that is they provide an app that has polling capability that simply asks you questions of personal wellness every day. And depending upon US state, and in some cases, which city you operate, there's certain questions you can ask and which questions you can't. And so you have to have a system that's flexible enough that can support all of those. So simply state, you know, are you well today? That's the line of first defense. Then you get people into the office. By the way, you can also then say who's going to be in the office, so you can plan accordingly from a social distancing perspective and the physical, the logistics of your facilities. But then once they're there, the tracing element really comes into play just to show whose path did they cross. And so if you talk about badging, what that does is that gives you access to who was in a building at any given time. Places like Japan, they badge out also, so you really can tighten the cohort of potentially impacted. And somebody in the chat here talked about how they were on a different floor from somebody that positively tested, and they appreciated that kind of outreach. And so what the systems that we're seeing people really clamor for are, let me know when somebody does become impacted, because we know it's a when, not an if, and then notify me accordingly. And somebody else mentioned in the chat about BLE. That's actually the route that we're seeing most people take. If they're gonna go to a high fidelity tracing solution that gets within three feet of proximity, it's gonna require an investment. Now, what the BLE does, the Bluetooth Low Energy with Beacon, what that does is it actually follows, which could be an anonymized piece of hardware around, to then create a digital path that gets replayed when somebody calls up and says that they were impacted. Now, this is different from the phone because the phone is a personal device. These badges, and most people you could have a wristband or a fob or something that you wear like a necklace. They're not invasive and they're easy to just put on once a day. And in some cases, they tie to your badge so that when you do badge in, it initiates the trace. So that's the route that we're seeing people do. And it's really much more of a dumb device than a smart device, because its sole purpose is to create a digital tracing of where you've been, so that you can lay that on top of the other paths of potentially impacted employees. And the way that these systems work is when you call up your HR process, which everybody seems to have nowadays, they're the ones that kick off the trace. And then they go back and they initiate an incident report to create that automatic impact report that you could then notify whatever your particular process and protocol is. So that's the kind of comprehensive solution we're seeing people go after, rather than just something that says, have this phone app, trace where I've been. They want a comprehensive solution.
There was one interesting question, by the way, that came up in Germany in this entire context from some people who didn't like the idea of being tracked at the workplace. And that question was, do they have a right to stay in home office if they don't want it? How can that be? If in theory, you could be almost as efficient in the home office as in the office and you don't like tracing, can you stay home?
Well, that's a great question, because what we're finding here, especially in the States, is people found out they can be really effective at working at home. And so now when we have conversations with customers, we say one of the value of these types of solutions is really giving the confidence to your employees to want to come back if and when the time is right, because there is going to be the struggle of demonstrating the need to go back to the office when you've been performing your job perfectly well, which when you talk about things like get back to work, we've all been working, we've just been working at a different location. So it's really return to the office safely, which is the bigger question here.
Yeah, there's also a consideration, of course, of all sorts of roles that can't be done remotely. If you're in manufacturing, if you need to be the IT person who is actually checking on the physical servers, if you are, handling special equipment that, the company's not going to up and move to your house, if you're doing, call center work where there's actually security protocols in place that are very difficult to do remotely. Those are kind of, I think, the ones where we really need to be thinking about these solutions. But I mean, otherwise, yes, I'm also a fan of, look, if you can work from home, work from home. It's a lot easier than throwing all this other technology on you just so you can see people's faces in the office, as much as I think a lot of us would like to do that again.
So in Germany, it fired up the entire discussion, because right now, as an employee, you cannot claim to go home and work from the home office, right? So you don't have to write to do that. It's in the end, it's the decision of the employer. However, the German government issued an initiative and stated that they are willing to work on a law providing exactly that in the future, which is obviously also triggered by the entire pandemic.
I think we're going to see a lot of discussions about the future of work, right? I mean, this year started out with internet giants like Google trying to ban home office completely because they had studies saying it was less effective. And then COVID came, and now they're doing home office for the entire year. I think there's a lot of flux in this, and we've got to be prepared for all of this. On the other hand, we also have to recognize, we're all social animals, right? And there is negative impact of social distancing because it is not natural to us.
Thank you. So I want to devote the last minutes we have and before we go to Q&A to this other large block of the discussion that we're having, which is acceptability, usability, and security. So those are like three characteristics we associate both with the technology itself, but also with the providers of the technology. We saw that very big on the discussion if Google and Apple should really be the providers of such an app, if they can be trusted. We're seeing that as well in Germany right now with usability issues coming up with the tracing app, that you have to have the latest operating system version, doesn't work on older systems, and some other things. So the question is how usable must the app be, and which parameters have to be set? Who do we have to think of, in particular, looking at the high-risk elderly people who are frequently maybe not that tech-savvy and do not have the inability to fine-tune their privacy settings or something? Should that be automated? How much should be automated? And who would be a good provider of an app? I think we have, as a German, I think we have a very good solution in Germany, running the app, having the app being run by the Robert Koch Institute, which from my point of view is a trustworthy entity in this respect. But how should this be solved? Should it be government, large tech? What are the requirements, and how can we fine tune the process to make it more digestible and more usable and to create more acceptability?
So I'll start out again. I believe that eventually there will be FOBs also available public from the public sector, like you can see in Singapore now. Simply because it makes sense. It's a way to go for kids. It's a way to go for elderly people, people who just dislike smartphones, whatever, and offer them the same type of service. On the question of who should handle this, I mean, it is very clear that the tech giants have taken a stand here and looked at this from a global perspective, like not giving data to any government, no matter whether it's democratically legitimized or not, is a globally acceptable view, right? Because if you make this available, a totalitarian regime could reuse it. On the other hand, from a view of a government that tries to be sovereign and it has a parliament and democratic elections and so on, that's a large infringement of local sovereignty, right? And you see the difference between Germany, where we said no, privacy is more important, and France, where they said our independence is more important. And I think both have good arguments, and I would have liked it if we had these arguments more in parliaments. In France, they took it to the parliament and it happened there. In Germany, it was never discussed in parliament, which is sad, but that's kind of a mute discussion if you look at it. In the end, it's the question, who do you trust more, right? So, and I think most users have made up their minds. They trust the internet companies more than they trust the governments. Which in itself is a bit strange, but that's the way it is.
Yeah, it is interesting. The concern here is oddly directed, in my view. That's people will install dozens of apps on their device that track their location all the time, and we're worried about a contact tracing solution that is so privacy maximized that you know, we're you know, some have thought about, oh well, what if you're, you know, sitting out there sniffing all these Bluetooth you know, beacons that everybody is, you know, emitting from their cell phone as they're walking by, and it's like, well, you could just put a camera up and watch everybody. I mean, I don't know what the, you know, it's a lot of concern about nothing. I think the you know, certainly like there are concerns about a lot of location data going into you know, centralized government repositories. But I mean, I think people need to look at that through the lens of the reality that they're sending off location data to a whole lot of private entities every day. Some of which they know that they're doing, and other of which the disclosures maybe aren't so great. So the you know, whether or not this should be mandatory, I think, you know, I don't think that's ever going to take on in the US. In fact, the way the law is going, it is going to make it harder to implement public contact tracing apps. The proposals, you know, if the Democrats and Republicans can ever agree on things like preemption and private rights of action, you know, we may see some federal law around this restricting what these types of apps can do. There was an opinion letter from a number of state AGs to Apple and Google voicing concerns about kind of private contact tracing apps that were showing up in the App Store that weren't sanctioned by government entities. I'm a little worried about here in California fragmentation of health authorities kind of coming up with their own apps. If the state doesn't have an app and we see, every Bay Area county comes up with their own thing, and then are they going to work with one another when people travel around so much? So there's certainly value in having these run by health authorities, but I am worried that there's not enough of a big picture view being placed on this right now at higher levels of government here.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one last question that came to my mind just recently, because we've seen that of course China uses this app as another excuse for population control and full tracing, but I think the disconcerting thing is that it's not just China, it's also a bunch of other countries going this way and abusing a tracing app as another tool for authoritarian regime. And having grown up in foreign policy for a large part of my professional life, one question that popped to my mind was whether we should probably come up with some foreign policy that should interfere in all these countries which are now abusing tracing apps for population control. Kuwait and Bahrain, for example, just popped the news a few days ago that they're using this to heavily infringe on the privacy of the citizens and basically trace and track everything they do. So while we are very much self-centered, I think, in this question, is this something that we should maybe also address in foreign policy and also address in the upcoming larger international discussions that we'll be having around Corona?
Can I say something cynical about this? Can we get the transatlantic policy right before we try to fix the world?
I mean, it's an important question because it's not going to go away if you're allowing them to do it now. At least that was the experience we had in the last decades around cybersecurity issues in many of these countries.
I personally, I think it's important to be aware of cultural, just differences in this regard and expectations. Even within Europe, right? There are some countries that you can't really put up a security camera without it being a whole ordeal, or have a dash cam in your car, and then other places where it's kind of expected that everybody has one of those. You look at like Russia, everybody's got a dash cam. And so I totally agree with Chris, like, let's figure out our own house and what we're gonna do and what works before we kind of start dictating to the rest of the world how to control the pandemic spread within their own populations.
Okay, so then let's jump to questions. We have a lot of great questions from the audience, and I would like to first get the question from Guido Yannis. Do you want to ask the question yourself, or is that even possible, Michaela?
Yeah, I can unmute myself.
Hey.
You got me?
We do.
Yeah, I'm just curious what size companies would even implement something like this. Doesn't seem to be reasonable for smaller companies to even start something like that. And then obviously, is it obsolete once we got a vaccine for it? Is this just for COVID, or can this be implemented for other pandemics in the future?
Yeah, so I can respond in my perspective on this one. So this piece I'm going to take as not just contact tracing, but just some level of care and that facilitates this the system of wellness. So what we're seeing for small and medium-sized businesses is the ability to at least have that line of first defense, which is to provide some sort of care through questionnaire that does reside on a mobile device. So simply help people to understand what are the things that that they believe, that an employer believes the employees should do to maintain safe. And then when they come into a work environment, what are the conditions and controls that they've agreed to when they come in there? So that would be on the lightweight version of that. So again, that can go down to any small employer. When you talk about, is this time stamped with a vaccine? The answer is no. My company was actually working on this application that we called the Safe Worker application 14 months ago, so long before the pandemic started. And the reason why is because we've had more 100-year events in the last decade than any time before. The geopolitical strife that's happening around the world, workplace violence, especially as demonstrated in the States, all of these different types of crises do require some sort of duty of care that creates a need for connective tissue between employer and employee. And that's what we're trying to build with some of these applications that we have. So we firmly believe that as soon as we get a vaccine, that's going to be an amazing thing globally. And then we're going to provide these tools that help people for any time of crisis globally.
Okay, sounds good.
I agree with Jay, right? So second answer, no. First answer, the smallest company I've seen really implementing a solution that includes tracing and medical testing was 50 people. And that was unexpected, but they did.
Okay, thank you. We have a good question from Robin Koenig on restaurants and the pen and paper approach. Robin, you want to ask the question yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm wondering how you see the situation, how restaurants and other businesses handle the situation currently in Germany. As far as I know, I live in California, but I'm German. As far as I know, right now in Germany, you're required to leave your contact details every time you go to a restaurant. The restaurant is then required to keep your personal information on a sheet of paper for the next couple of weeks. Do you expect this practice to continue now that we have this official contact tracing app, or do you even see a solution similar to what there is in Germany right now to be rolled out in the US?
If you were a screenwriter, having witnessed the privacy debate in Germany, then followed by exactly the measures you're describing now, where everybody has to leave their name and phone number at a restaurant, if you had written that in a screenplay, people would have deleted it for being unrealistic, right? So it is weird. I hope it's not going to continue.
Yeah, I can't imagine this kind of taking off in the US. I mean, people here are protesting just because they have to put a mask on. I mean, which is like the least you can do, and have a little distance from people. The idea that you would have to, leave your name so that, with every place you visit, I think you'd have people rioting in the streets over that. As ridiculous as that may be.
But Eddie, as you mentioned before, it's funny because everybody books through Open Table, Resi, or others.
Oh,
so they've
sure.
already created a digital path.
Yeah. That is absolutely right. But and the DoorDash and everything else. But the idea that when you're physically there and someone's like, okay, I need to take your name and your contact information, so in case somebody gets sick here, I think. Geez, I mean, they just, trying to get into a place right now, the Costco asks you, hey, can you put your mask on? And, the police get called, and it's just ridiculous. I don't see that being like a realistic path forward here. But yeah, maybe Open Table and everything else is the way to go. They'll be the new contact tracers. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Barbara Meyer, you had a bunch of very good questions, so you can choose your favorite question now and ask it. Barbara, are you around or?
Yeah, here I am. Yeah. Oh my gosh, I read so many comments. I don't even remember which one would be the most appropriate to ask at this point. But I had some concerns about workplace. I work for the government, and we have huge cubicle floors. I don't even know how many people are on there, maybe a couple hundreds on one floor, and initially when the pandemic started, and of course we all use the same lunchrooms and the same bathrooms and whatnot. And when the pandemic started, then I did hear from my coworker that somebody like 5 cubicles over from me tested positive for COVID, but we never really got informed, officially. And I felt kind of lucky at the time because I I was coughing a lot, and my coworkers were freaking out, and it turned out like I had asthma, and I ended up working from home by getting a doctor's note to allow me to work from home for that first week before our employer finally decided that we could all be working from home. But there's definitely some concerns about when people do test positive, and and of course then there's privacy because nobody's allowed to say who it was, right? So just a lot of concerns related to big cubicle floors, and I guess privacy too, but also like the concerns of the coworkers in terms of getting sick. So I don't know if it's as much of a question as it's a comment.
I like the question about the how you can incentivize the download of the tracing app.
Yeah, right. Because somebody mentioned forcing people, and I'm thinking that never works. You can't force people, but if you can incentivize them, that seems to happen a lot with governments, that they incentivize people to disclose certain information by giving them tax breaks or other kinds of, perks or whatnot.
So should we incentivize? Does anybody have a good idea for an incentive apart from public health and caring for your other?
I think humanly, that's the worst possible thing. Honestly, I will give you a tax break if you are nice enough not to make your fellow people sick. Blah.
Yeah, how about you can enter the property and you're allowed to you're allowed to come in in contact with other people. And no, I think there are really kind of two things going on here. One is are incentivizing people or trying to get people to install like the public health option, which is, I think, with the idea being that if people are getting notifications about contacts they have, out in the public space, that can help reduce the risk of infected people entering the workplace. I think that's going to be a bigger challenge. But then coming back to tracking within the workplace, I think is a lot more straightforward. It's not an incentive based. It's a, do you want to enter or not? And also, quite frankly, I don't think the relying on the public option in the private space is a particularly good solution, because they don't really, the employer doesn't get any data, right? You're not be able to see where your employees are. You're not able to figure out like what are the areas that I need to disinfect more, or there's a lot of useful information that can come from tracking more precise location in a facility, because then maybe you make design changes about how the cubicles are structured, or maybe you find out that you need to change how airflows work, or what groups are coming in when, and it's hard to do that when you're relying on a public health solution that doesn't share anything with you, and you don't know, why did these two people get sick when it doesn't, did it happen because of work, or is it just a coincidence? And with more granular data, you might be able to figure that out and really help protect people.
Okay, thank you. I think we have to close Q&A now, and now we will have another poll. I think, Michaela, if it works, and see if anybody changed an opinion.
Can you see the poll, or because we may have an issue?
We only have sensible people here anyway.
Because I cannot see that people are voting actually. Caroline, I think last time you could see.
Yes, I can. we have 25 people who voted so far. So we have so far almost 90%, 88% that would download the app. But you know, like you said, we have sensitive people here.
And was that the first poll, or is that now the second poll that I tried to launch?
That's a second poll that is going on right now. Yes.
And the first one, I think you also could.
I think the first one was similar. Yeah, first one, I don't see if I can get back the results. I can close it now. I don't think people are voting anymore, and then I can share it. You see it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think is that the second one? I thought the first one was
that's not the first one. That's not what I saw.
Yeah,
the
that's
first one was like 78% or something.
Yeah, 76.
Yeah.
Okay, so that just reconfirms that we had an excellent panel, which was absolutely able to spread a lot of propaganda successfully and convince everybody to actually do tracing. And with that, I would like to thank the panel, and I myself have to leave. And now I will give it back to you, Michaela, for the separate speed dating rooms.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Sandro. And thank you very much to all the other speakers. We would like to stay online if you can for a networking opportunity, since this is what these events are about, at least partially. So we encourage everyone to participate in the networking part. If you're not planning to do so, then it would be good if you log out now or in the next minute or so before we actually establish the breakout rooms. They will be randomly assigned, and we will have a 10-minute session once and another 10-minute session a second time with a different group of people. Again, it will be randomly assigned. It will be 4 to 5 people in each session. In the session, feel free to introduce each other and continue to discuss the contact tracing or your interests or your experiences and so on. Yeah, so again, if you're not planning to participate in this networking session, then please log out of Zoom. Otherwise, we will have half-empty rooms, which would not be great for a discussion. Yeah, so thank you, everyone, and enjoy the networking experience as well. I think Evie is still working on it, getting the rooms together. And you have to